The year is 1945. The rising sun of the Japanese Empire has begun to set. From the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Pacific, Japan's once unstoppable army is retreating. Cities lie in ruins. Civilians scatter in fear. And amid this chaos are thousands of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, missionaries, and refugees, caught in a war that is collapsing around them. They never imagined they would become prisoners of war. Yet as the empire crumbled, that is exactly what happened. Glow showing Asia-Australia the fall of the empire. During the early years of World War II, Japan expanded rapidly across Asia and the Pacific. Its soldiers captured Singapore, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and large parts of China and Southeast Asia. Many Japanese women accompanied the military, not as combatants, but as nurses, administrators, or support staff working in field hospitals, communication units, and supply bases. Others were civilians living in colonies or mission territories. But by late 1944, the tide had turned. American bombing raids reduced Japanese cities to ash. Allied forces advanced through the Pacific, retaking island after island. As they moved closer to Japan, thousands of Japanese personnel, men and women, were stranded outside their homeland. Retreat and capture. When the Philippines fell in 1945, many Japanese units were cut off from evacuation. In places like Luzon, Mindanao, and Borneo, female nurses and civilian workers found themselves surrounded. Some hid in jungles, surviving on whatever they could find. Others surrendered, exhausted and starving, to Allied troops. Captured women were transported to temporary holding areas under Allied command. Here, fear replaced loyalty. They had been taught from childhood that surrender was the worst possible shame. Japanese propaganda had told them that Allied soldiers were monsters, so many believed they would be killed instantly. Instead, they were taken to POW camps, uncertain of what awaited them. Shock of surrender. For Japanese women, surrender meant more than captivity. It meant spiritual collapse. The Bushido Code, deeply rooted in Japanese culture, demanded loyalty unto death. To live after surrender was considered dishonor. As they marched under guard, some wept quietly. Others stared blankly ahead, numb with disbelief. Allied soldiers, too, were unprepared. They had rarely encountered Japanese women prisoners before. In most battles, Japanese troops fought to the death rather than surrender. The sight of women in Japanese uniforms, nurses, clerks, and communication staff, was strange and unsettling to them. Derelict house transport to Allied camps. Most female prisoners were held in the Philippines under U.S. control, Australia, Burma and India under British command, and Soviet territories in Manchuria and Siberia. Transportation was harsh. Ships were overcrowded. Food and water were scarce. Some prisoners fell ill on the journey. Others were interrogated for intelligence. Where had they worked? What did they know of Japanese military plans? For many of these women, this was the first time they heard Allied voices, not as distant enemies, but as men speaking directly to them. Some guards treated them with professionalism, others with suspicion and resentment. Broken heart between two worlds. These women found themselves between two collapsing worlds. Their own empire, which no longer protected them, and their captors, who saw them as part of the enemy machine. They were neither civilians nor soldiers, yet punished as both. The propaganda that had glorified sacrifice had abandoned them. And back home, few would ever know their names. Narrator, reflective tone. For these women, captivity began not only with chains or fences, but with a shattering of identity itself. They were no longer nurses of the emperor. They were simply prisoners, facing an uncertain fate in a war that had already taken everything from them. Life inside POW camps. Studio microphone, narrator, calm but somber tone. For the Japanese women captured across Asia and the Pacific, the long journey did not end with surrender. It only changed shape. Their battle was no longer fought with weapons or uniforms, but with hunger, illness, and the quiet ache of humiliation. Derelict house arrival at the camps. Most of the female prisoners arrived weak, dehydrated, and frightened. Their first stop was often a temporary holding enclosure, makeshift barracks built from bamboo or corrugated metal, surrounded by barbed wire. Armed guards patrolled the fences. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and fear. In some Allied camps, especially those in the Philippines and Australia, Japanese POWs were kept separately from male prisoners. Their quarters were small, and privacy was almost non-existent. Thin mats served as beds, mosquito nets were rare luxuries. Every personal item, letters, photographs, even small trinkets from home, was confiscated during registration. They were now numbers, not names. Cooked rice daily routine. The camp day began before sunrise. A whistle or bell signaled roll call. The women lined up under the eyes of foreign guards who barked instructions in English, words many of them couldn't understand. Those who failed to respond quickly enough faced harsh discipline, extra labor, reduced rations, or long hours standing in the heat. Meals were simple: a tin bowl of watery soup, a handful of rice or flour, sometimes vegetables. Protein was rare. Malnutrition and disease spread easily. Dysentery, malaria, and pneumonia took many lives quietly. To maintain morale, some women formed small groups they called family circles. They cooked together, shared stories, and whispered lullabies from home at night. These moments of tenderness were their rebellion against despair, work, and labor. Although international law required humane treatment, in practice the camps were harsh. Japanese women were made to wash laundry for soldiers, clean medical stations, or work in the camp kitchens. Some were assigned to agricultural labor, digging soil, carrying water, or tending vegetable plots to feed the camp. The work was exhausting, especially under tropical sun or Siberian cold. Their hands blistered and bled, nails cracked from washing uniforms in chemical soap. But labor also gave rhythm to the days. It helped them survive, 1 hour at a time. Speech balloon language and isolation. Few of the guards spoke Japanese, few prisoners spoke English. Simple misunderstandings often led to punishment. A missed order, a wrong gesture, even a nervous smile could be seen as defiance. Some Allied soldiers, especially those who had fought in brutal Pacific battles, viewed any Japanese uniform with anger. To them, even a nurse symbolized the enemy who had killed their friends. The women felt this bitterness like an invisible weight. Still, humanity flickered through the cracks. One Australian medic secretly gave extra medicine to sick prisoners. An American guard left apples by the fence without saying a word. These small mercies stayed in memory long after liberation, rules, and control. The camps operated under Allied military command, bound, at least officially, by the Geneva Conventions. But enforcement varied widely. In Soviet-controlled territories, discipline was far more severe. In British or American zones, treatment ranged from strict to fair depending on the officers in charge. Women were not tortured systematically, yet many faced verbal humiliation and intrusive searches. They were made to bow repeatedly, sometimes forced to clean areas while soldiers mocked them. The humiliation was intentional, a way to break the pride of those once loyal to the emperor. For many women, the greatest pain was spiritual. They had been raised to serve Japan with purity and obedience. Now, stripped of rank and purpose, they questioned their own worth. Letters never sent. Once every few months, the Red Cross was allowed to visit certain camps. Prisoners were sometimes permitted to write letters home, but few ever arrived. Paper was scarce. Censors cut out entire paragraphs. Mothers wrote to children they feared were dead. Daughters wrote to parents who would never see them again. Those unsent letters became the silent history of captivity, lost between empires. Candle faith and resilience. Some prisoners turned to faith for comfort. In a camp near Manila, a nurse named Yoshiko Tanaka built a small shrine from twigs and stones. Every evening, she gathered a few women and recited Buddhist prayers for peace. In the Siberian camps, others carved tiny wooden crosses or folded paper cranes. Even in suffering, they sought meaning. Inside the barbed wire, time dissolved. Days bled into weeks, weeks into years. Some women counted sunsets, others memorized poems to keep their minds alive. They learned that survival was not only about food or shelter. It was about remembering who they were before the war tried to erase them. Violence and harassment. Studio microphone, narrator, solemn tone. War does not end when the guns fall silent. For the Japanese women prisoners, a different war began. One fought in silence, through prejudice, power, and pain. Crossed swords the shadow of hatred. By the time the Allied camps filled with Japanese prisoners, the memory of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and Nanjing was still raw. Many Allied soldiers had lost family or comrades to Japan's brutal campaigns. That anger did not vanish with victory. It often seeped into daily interactions, sharp words, cold stares, or deliberate neglect. To be a Japanese prisoner, and especially a Japanese woman, meant carrying the weight of an empire's sins. Even though most of these women had never held a weapon, they were treated as symbols of Japan's aggression. This made them targets for humiliation and discrimination inside the camps. Psychological harassment and control. Supervisors often used psychological pressure rather than overt physical violence. The goal was to destroy the sense of superiority and pride Japanese captives had been taught. Guards mocked their accents, their manners, and their loyalty to the emperor. Some made them sing Allied songs or clean latrines while being taunted. A British officer's diary from Burma described one camp. They bow automatically, still thinking themselves servants of a dead god. We remind them that their emperor cannot hear them here. These moments of degradation were designed to rewrite power, to turn conquerors into the conquered. Bomb fear and vulnerability. In captivity, rumors traveled faster than truth. Whispers of assault or mistreatment, whether real or imagined, kept fear alive. Many women avoided speaking to guards, even those who showed kindness, afraid that any attention could be misinterpreted. The line between prisoner and protector blurred dangerously. Some officers maintained strict professionalism, treating the women humanely. Others exploited their authority to intimidate and control through words, inspections, or threats. It was a kind of violence that left no visible scars, but deep emotional wounds. Woman standing the weight of shame. In Japanese culture of the 1940s, honor and purity were sacred. To be imprisoned, and worse, humiliated, was seen as a deep disgrace. Even without physical abuse, the sense of shame was overwhelming. Some women refused food, others avoided looking at themselves in mirrors. They feared how their families would see them if they ever returned. Would anyone believe their suffering? Would anyone even want to know? In one camp in the Philippines, a nurse named Aiko Mori kept a secret diary. She wrote, "I cannot cry in front of the others. We smile by day, but inside we are ghosts. I pray my mother never imagines me like this." Her notebook was found years later, hidden under a loose floorboard. A quiet testimony to the torment that went unspoken. Mantelpiece clock power, silence, and memory. Allied command officially prohibited abuse of prisoners, and many officers enforced those rules. But isolated camps, limited oversight, and the emotions of war made violations hard to control. Some complaints never reached higher authorities, some were buried in paperwork. It was easier for both sides to move on and forget. After liberation, very few Japanese women spoke publicly about what they endured. Many destroyed their journals or refused interviews. They did not see themselves as victims, they saw themselves as disgraced survivors. In post-war Japan, society preferred stories of heroism and rebuilding, not of shame or captivity. Their silence became another prison. Violence does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. In insults that strip away dignity. In silence that hides the truth. In the eyes of those who pretend not to see. For these women, survival meant carrying both the visible and invisible scars of war. They endured, not because the world was kind, but because they refused to let cruelty define them. Survival and solidarity. In every war, there are those who lose everything, and yet somehow find the will to go on. For the Japanese women prisoners, captivity stripped them of country, pride, and freedom. But in that emptiness, they discovered something unexpected. Each other. Finding family behind barbed wire. In the beginning, most women lived in quiet fear. They were surrounded by enemies, cut off from home, unsure of what the next day would bring. But soon, small groups began to form. A nurse would share her soup with a sick comrade. A young clerk would patch another's torn uniform with thread made from her own clothes. They called these groups Kazoku families. Each family looked after one another. They celebrated birthdays with pebbles as candles. They whispered old songs under the moonlight. In those fragile moments, they rebuilt a sense of belonging that war had tried to destroy, kindness across enemy lines. Amid the cruelty and suspicion, there were flickers of unexpected humanity. In one camp in New Guinea, an Australian nurse secretly left medical supplies for captured Japanese women. She later wrote, "They were not the soldiers who fought us. They were women like me, tired, hungry, trying to keep dignity alive." In another camp, an American officer noticed how the women had no soap or hygiene supplies. He arranged for them to receive small parcels, toothbrushes, soap, paper, and pencils. To the prisoners, these were treasures worth more than gold. They used the paper to write poems and letters that kept hope alive. Such acts did not erase the suffering, but they reminded everyone that mercy could survive even amid hatred, teaching, healing, remembering. To keep their minds from collapsing under boredom and despair, some women turned to education. They began teaching one another whatever they knew. Math, poetry, sewing, even bits of English or Russian. One woman, Miyako Sato, a former schoolteacher, taught the others Japanese literature from memory. Every evening, she recited lines from the Tale of Genji by candlelight, her voice soft but steady. The others would listen, eyes closed, transported for a moment back to the lives they once knew. In a Soviet camp, another group of women began caring for injured male prisoners. Despite being sick themselves, their care saved many lives. One Soviet medic later described them as braver than any soldier I met. Love letters of hope. Whenever the Red Cross allowed correspondence, the women wrote carefully, choosing words that would not be censored. They wrote not of pain, but of endurance. "We are healthy," one wrote, though she was not. "The sky is still beautiful here," another added, though she could not see it through the fence. These letters were acts of defiance, proof that their spirit remained unbroken. Speech balloon friendship beyond war. Over time, some guards began to see the prisoners differently. The hatred that once filled the camps slowly faded. A few Allied soldiers even exchanged quiet greetings with the women, a nod, a smile, a shared cigarette. Nothing more, but enough to remind both sides of their humanity. In one documented case, after the war ended, an Australian nurse kept in touch with a Japanese prisoner she had once guarded. They wrote letters for nearly 20 years. Two women from opposite sides of a terrible war, united by compassion. Endurance through faith. Faith, in many forms, gave the women strength. Some prayed to the spirits of their ancestors, others whispered Buddhist chants. A few who had studied Christianity prayed with makeshift rosaries carved from seeds. They prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness and peace. When rations ran out, they shared what little they had. When illness spread, they took turns nursing each other, even at risk to themselves. Many survived because of this solidarity, not through strength of body, but through strength of heart. The camps were places of suffering, yes, but also places where the smallest acts of kindness became heroic. A shared meal, a whispered prayer, a hand reaching out in the dark. These women did not win battles or medals, but they won something greater. The victory of compassion over cruelty. The survival of their humanity in a world that had forgotten its own. After the war. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Japan's emperor spoke to his people in a trembling radio voice, announcing surrender for the first time in history. Across Asia, the guns fell silent. But for those behind barbed wire, the Japanese women prisoners' freedom did not come with cheers. It came quietly and too late for many. Of the long wait for freedom. News of Japan's surrender spread slowly through the camps. At first, few believed it. Could the empire that once ruled half of Asia truly have fallen? When confirmation came, Many women wept not only from relief, but from confusion. They no longer knew who they were without the war. Allied officers informed them that repatriation would begin soon. But soon meant months. Ships were scarce, and priority went first to Allied soldiers returning home. So the Japanese prisoners waited once again. This time not as captives of war, but as forgotten people in a world struggling to rebuild. Returning home. When the repatriation ships finally left the ports of Manila, Singapore, and Vladivostok, the women watched the horizon in silence. Many carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few paper letters from the camps. As the ships neared Japan, they saw the devastation for the first time. Cities flattened, harbors filled with wreckage, smoke still rising from ruins. Their homeland no longer looked like the place they had dreamed of in captivity. When they disembarked, few families came to greet them. Many relatives believed the women had died long ago. Some, upon learning they had been prisoners, turned away in shame. To surrender had been dishonorable. To survive captivity was seen by some as unpatriotic. In post-war Japan, there were no parades for returning POWs. Only silence. Luggage life after captivity. Life in post-war Japan was hard for everyone, but for former prisoners, it was especially cruel. The government did little to support them. Employment was scarce. Discrimination was common. When asked about their past, many women simply said they had worked overseas. The truth remained locked away in memory. A few became teachers or nurses again. Some married quietly and tried to rebuild their lives. Others carried trauma that words could never express. Flinching at loud noises, avoiding mirrors, waking from dreams of fences and sirens. Yet through their silence, they shaped a quiet kind of resilience. They became part of Japan's post-war generation that rebuilt a broken nation, brick by brick, heart by heart, forgotten by history. For decades, almost no one spoke about Japanese women POWs. Historians focused on soldiers, generals, and battles, not on nurses or civilians who suffered in captivity. Even Japan's own textbooks barely mention them. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scholars began uncovering diaries, letters, and interviews from survivors. What they found were stories of endurance, of women who had faced hunger, humiliation, and loss, but still helped others survive. One historian wrote, "They were not heroines in the traditional sense. They fought no battles. Yet their survival was itself a victory. The victory of spirit over despair." Voices from the past. In the 1990s, a few surviving women finally agreed to speak publicly. Their voices were soft, but their words carried decades of silence. One said, "I do not hate the guards. We were all young, all trapped in the same storm." Another said simply, "I forgave, but I never forgot." Their testimonies reminded the world that suffering knows no nationality, that victims and victors alike carry the scars of war. Cherry blossom legacy and reflection. Today, memorials and documentaries have begun to honor these forgotten women. Historians now see them as an essential part of Japan's wartime story, not as symbols of shame, but as witnesses to the cost of blind obedience and war's inhumanity. Their story asks a timeless question. How do we heal from the wounds we cannot see? For the Japanese women POWs, healing came slowly. Through forgiveness, through family, through the simple act of living on. Studio microphone, closing narration, gentle, emotional tone. The war is long over. The camps have vanished, their fences rusted away. But somewhere in old diaries, in fading photographs, the faces of these women still watch us, reminding us that peace is not born from power, but from understanding. They were the forgotten captives of a forgotten war. And by remembering them, we honor not only their suffering, but their extraordinary courage to survive with dignity. Even when the world turned its back. War, everyone loses something. But when we remember, truly remember, no one is ever forgotten. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Bye-bye.